5 American wars. 5 families got rich from every single one. Not rumor, not internet theory. Contracts, invoices, congressional hearings, annual reports. The paper trail is public because the system doesn't need secrecy to work. It only needs attention to drift elsewhere. And here's the pattern that keeps repeating in American history. While soldiers bleed and taxpayers pay, a small circle of companies wins every time. There's a business model more consistent than oil, more protected than banking, and harder to challenge than any monopoly. It has funded dynasties for 6 generations. It has paid for political careers, endowed universities, and built foundations that wash war money into respectability. The premise is brutally simple. Profit from war. Every war. Any war. Because war is the only market where demand becomes absolute. When war arrives, the government doesn't negotiate like a normal buyer. It panics, it mobilizes, it signs. It needs explosives, fuel, weapons, financing, logistics, now. And in that moment, the rules of competition don't just loosen, they vanish. That's why the same names keep rising out of the smoke. DuPont, gunpowder, explosives, chemicals, war after war since the early 1800s. Rockefeller, oil and fuel, modern war's bloodstream. Morgan, war financing, profit whether the bullets hit or miss. Lockheed's predecessors, aircraft and weapons, contracts that never truly end. Halliburton, logistics and infrastructure, war support turned into an art form. 5 families, 5 corporate lineages, and if you track what happens around every major American conflict, you see the same sequence play out like a ritual. War is declared, stock prices surge, contracts are awarded, costs explode. War ends, they keep the money and the infrastructure, and when the next war starts, they're already positioned. Because the dark truth isn't only that they profit from war, it's that many of them help create the conditions that make war predictable. Lobbying, campaign donations, think tanks, revolving door careers that blur the line between national security and private revenue. This isn't conspiracy, this is capitalism applied to conflict, and the receipts are sitting in plain sight. So let's walk through it, war by war, contract by contract, starting with the family that didn't just participate in the military-industrial complex, they helped prototype it. The DuPont pattern, profit before the battle starts. If you've heard DuPont, you might think of chemicals, nylon, Teflon, modern materials that feel civilian and clean. But the DuPont fortune begins in a much older, darker substance, gunpowder. Éluth Irénée DuPont arrived in America from France in 1800. He wasn't a romantic immigrant chasing freedom. He was a trained chemist who understood production. He had worked around French gunpowder operations. He saw what a young country like America would need constantly: expansion, mining, construction, and inevitable conflict. In 1802, he founded a gunpowder mill on the Brandywine River in Delaware. The location wasn't poetic, it was strategic. Close enough to political power centers like Philadelphia and Washington to secure business, powered by water to run mills efficiently, and far enough from major cities that if something exploded, and in that industry explosions weren't hypotheticals, it wouldn't become a political scandal. From the beginning, DuPont wasn't just manufacturing gunpowder, they were manufacturing position. Because here's the first rule of war profit. You don't wait for war to begin. You build capacity during peace, so you're the only option when war arrives. By the War of 1812, DuPont was supplying gunpowder to the U.S. military, one of the company's first major government relationships, and the pattern locked in early. War starts, government needs explosives immediately. DuPont already has capacity. DuPont gets the deal. DuPont expands production on public demand. War ends. DuPont keeps the upgraded infrastructure. The government moves on. The company keeps the machine. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, deepened that relationship. DuPont supplied gunpowder for artillery and small arms. The contract value in historical accounts is often cited as over $1 million, serious money for the era. But the real value wasn't the revenue, it was the status. When the next conflict starts, the first question is never, who is best? It's, who delivered last time? That preference becomes inheritance. And then came the Civil War, DuPont's breakthrough. The Union didn't need gunpowder like previous wars, it needed it like oxygen. 4 years of industrial-scale fighting, hundreds of battles, relentless demand. DuPont's mills ran day and night, millions of pounds produced, enormous contracts, and layers of profit, direct sales plus sales to subs. And here's where the story turns colder. The DuPont family's politics were complicated. Some were Northern Democrats, some opposed abolition, some sympathized with the South in sentiment. Yet the company sold to the Union because the Union was the buyer with the deepest wallet and the largest procurement engine. In war profit, ideology often becomes theater. Revenue is the real flag. After the war, the winners controlled the narrative. DuPont became patriotic, a savior supplier, while the moral ambiguity faded behind the official story. And then World War I turned that supplier relationship into a global engine. Even before America entered the war in 1917, European powers were buying. Britain and France needed explosives. DuPont sold. When the US joined, production surged again. New plants, thousands of workers, contracts that scaled beyond anything the 19th century could imagine. DuPont's earnings exploded, one of those historical leaps that looks like a typo until you see how war purchasing works. When the buyer is the state and the clock is life or death, margins stop behaving like margins. In 4 years, DuPont didn't just make money, they made a transformation. Because here's rule 2. War money is not just profit. War money is seed capital. After World War I, DuPont used explosive profits to diversify into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials, building a peacetime empire funded by wartime demand. So even when the guns fell silent, the fortune didn't. It hardened. And this is where the pattern begins to resemble something larger than a single company. It begins to look like a national habit, like a system that converts bloodshed into capital, then launders it into progress, industry, and innovation. And once you see DuPont's arc, you start noticing the next layer. Explosives are only one ingredient. Modern war needs fuel. It needs oil. And no family learned to control oil the way the Rockefellers did, turning every conflict into an energy contract and every energy contract into another century of leverage. Because if DuPont sells the spark, Rockefeller sells the bloodstream. And when that bloodstream becomes essential to fleets, tanks, trucks, and aircraft, war stops being a tragedy alone. It becomes a guaranteed market. Next, we move from gunpowder to petroleum, from mills on a river to the monopoly that powered the American century. If DuPont proved you could build a dynasty by selling the spark, the Rockefellers proved you could build one by owning the bloodstream. Because modern war isn't won by courage alone, it's won by fuel. And once the US military began shifting from coal to oil at the turn of the 20th century, petroleum stopped being a commodity. It became strategy. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. By 1880, it controlled roughly 90% of America's refining capacity, an industrial chokehold so complete it functioned like a private utility. And when a nation goes to war, the supplier that controls the choke point becomes more than a contractor. It becomes indispensable. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was short, But it mattered because it marked a transition. Naval technology was changing. Coal was heavy, slow to load, and limited in range. Oil was lighter, more energy-dense, faster to refuel. It made fleets more mobile and wars more global. So even that small war taught a lesson that would govern the next century. Control the fuel, and you control the speed of war itself. Rockefeller and his successor companies supplied the fuel. Contracts were not always dramatic, but the dependency was, and dependency is the point. Then World War I arrived, the first industrial war where petroleum wasn't optional. Tanks, trucks, airplanes, ships, everything that moved at scale required oil. And here's the trick. Standard Oil had been broken up by antitrust order in 1911, but the breakup didn't remove Rockefeller influence from the market. It fragmented the brand, not the system. The successor companies still dominated their regions. The network remained, the pipelines remained, the expertise remained. So when the US and allies needed fuel, the Rockefeller orbit was ready. But the Rockefeller war profit pattern differs from DuPont's in one chilling way. DuPont could sell explosives, then pivot into chemicals. Rockefeller's asset was more structural. Oil sits under everything, which meant that when war expanded, Rockefeller's leverage expanded with it. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the historical record shows that national loyalty becomes complicated when global subsidiaries and legal structures are involved. Even in wartime, large multinationals often keep doing business through neutral intermediaries, foreign affiliates, supply chains that don't respect the morality of flags. This isn't always illegal, it's simply the outcome of corporate structure. If you split the entity into separate companies and separate jurisdictions, responsibility fragments, even while the profit stream remains connected. That's why, across multiple conflicts, investigations surfaced into corporate dealings with enemy economies, patent sharing arrangements, and trading through subsidiaries. And what typically happened? A few headlines, a committee, a stern report, and then reality returned, because the state needed fuel. And when the state needs something essential, enforcement becomes flexible. The Rockefeller wealth compounded. Oil didn't just fund the family, it funded entry into other pillars of power: banking, real estate, philanthropy, global influence. The story becomes less oil company and more economic architecture. But oil is only the physical side of war. War also has a financial engine. Weapons and fuel don't arrive because they're morally necessary. They arrive because they're paid for. And the most reliable war profit in history is not selling bullets, it's lending the money that buys them. The Morgan pattern: profit whether anyone wins. J.P. Morgan's empire emerges in the late 19th century as America consolidates industrial power into finance. By around 1000, Morgan's firm sat at the center of American capital markets. And Morgan understood something ruthless. Governments at war will borrow at almost any rate, because their alternative isn't tightened budgets, their alternative is defeat. That's what makes war financing such a perfect business. It transforms survival into a credit arrangement. The Spanish-American War again serves as the early rehearsal. The U.S. needed financing mechanisms, bond issuance, underwriting, institutional trust. Morgan and allied banks were involved in the ecosystem of war borrowing, establishing the relationship between the state and private finance. Then World War I arrived and everything scaled. When the war began in Europe in 1914, America was officially neutral, but American finance wasn't. American banks, led by Morgan interests, helped arrange massive lending to Britain and France. Those loans financed purchases of weapons, food, and supplies, often from American firms. So the money moved in a circle that looks almost too clean. Banks lend to allies. Allies buy American goods. American companies profit. Banks collect interest and fees, and the state becomes economically tied to the war's outcome. And here is the critical documented mechanism behind the idea that war can become economically inevitable. By 1917, Britain and France owed U.S. financial institutions so much that their defeat would have threatened repayment. Non-repayment would have meant losses, market panic, potential crisis. This created a structural bias towards intervention. Not because bankers commanded the government like puppet masters, history is messier than that, but because the financial system had placed itself in a position that one outcome was survivable and the other was catastrophic. Neutrality wasn't just a moral stance anymore, it was a balance sheet risk. This is where the famous critique surfaces in the political record, the idea that America was being dragged into conflict by financial interest. Senators debated it openly. Critics argued that gold was steering policy. Whether you agree with every accusation or not, the underlying mechanism is real. When private finance has lent billions into a war's outcome, it has a stake in the winner. After World War I, the Morgan profit pattern didn't end, it evolved. The war created reparations, sovereign debts, refinancing schemes, an entire post-war economy built on payment plans. Germany owed reparations to the Allies owed money to the United States, and the financial system created layered loans to keep the chain moving. Banks collected fees at every step. So even after the guns stopped, the war kept paying. Then World War II repeated the model at even larger scale. Government borrowing, bond issuance, underwriting, post-war reconstruction finance. War bonds became patriotic symbols, but behind the symbolism sat an enormous machinery of issuance, distribution, and institutional management. The state raised money. Banks facilitated the raising. Fees and influence flowed in return. And then the Cold War ensured the engine never shut off. Korea, Vietnam, arms races, military budgets that became permanent. Which means the most radical transformation of the 20th century wasn't just weapons, it was this. War stopped being an emergency, it became a standing industry. And now you can see the shape of what's coming next. DuPont builds the spark and uses profits to diversify. Rockefeller controls the bloodstream and becomes indispensable. Morgan finances the entire body and profits from the interest regardless of outcome. But the modern era adds another dimension. War becomes technological. Aviation, surveillance, weapons systems so complex that budgets become estimates and estimates become invitations. Because once war turns into software, sensors, and trillion-dollar platforms, the contract stops being a purchase, it becomes a dependency. And that dependency is where the next dynasty-scale engine emerges. The defense contractors, the aircraft builders who learned that the most profitable weapon is the one that can never be canceled. Next, Lockheed's rise and how cost overruns became not a failure, but a business model.
If DuPont proved how to profit before war begins, and Rockefeller showed how to become indispensable once war arrives, and Morgan demonstrated how to profit whether war is won or lost, then the modern defense contractor perfected something even more powerful. A war product so complex, so embedded, and so politically protected that stopping it becomes impossible. This is where aviation enters the story, and where war becomes not just an event, but a permanent revenue stream. The Lockheed pattern, when overruns become the business model. The company we now call Lockheed Martin did not begin as a juggernaut. It began, like many early aviation firms, as a risky bet on a fragile technology. The Lougheed brothers, later anglicized to Lockheed, founded their aircraft company in 1912. In World War I, aviation was still experimental. Planes were used mainly for reconnaissance, with limited combat roles. Contracts were small. The profits were modest. But the lesson was clear. Aircraft would decide future wars. After World War I, military aviation budgets collapsed. Many aircraft companies went bankrupt. Lockheed survived by pivoting to civilian aircraft, but crucially, it never severed its military ties. It understood something that would define the next century. You don't abandon the Pentagon between wars. You maintain just enough relevance to be indispensable when the next one comes. World War II changed everything. Air power was no longer auxiliary, it was central. Bombers, fighters, transports, entire campaigns depended on aircraft, and Lockheed was ready. They produced the P-38 Lightning fighter, over 10,000 units. They built bombers and transports at scale. Contracts exploded into the hundreds of millions. But Lockheed's real innovation wasn't engineering, it was political architecture. They learned how to make a weapons program untouchable. Here's how. First, they distributed production. Factories weren't located based solely on efficiency. They were placed in key congressional districts, areas where representatives needed jobs for their voters. Every factory meant thousands of constituents whose livelihoods depended on continued funding. Voting against a Lockheed program became politically dangerous. Second, they mastered the revolving door. Retired military officers became defense executives. Former Pentagon officials became consultants. The people who approved contracts today became beneficiaries tomorrow. This wasn't hidden, it was normalized. Third, and most important, they embraced cost-plus contracting. Under cost-plus contract, the government agrees to pay all costs, plus a guaranteed profit margin. This flips the logic of business upside down. In a normal market, efficiency increases profit. In cost-plus, higher costs increase profit. Delays don't hurt the contractor. Design changes don't hurt the contractor. Unexpected complexity doesn't hurt the contractor. The taxpayer absorbs the risk. And once billions are spent, cancellation becomes politically unthinkable. No politician wants to admit they approved a project that wasted billions and killed jobs. So overruns aren't punished, they're rewarded. The C-5 Galaxy transport plane illustrates this perfectly. Initially approved in the 1960s, roughly $2.1 billion, the program ultimately cost more than double that. Lockheed didn't lose money, they made more. The government couldn't walk away. The same logic scales forward into the modern era. The F-35 fighter jet, the most expensive weapons system in history, was sold as a revolutionary all-purpose aircraft. Initial cost estimates were already massive. Current lifetime cost projections exceed $1.7 trillion. That's not a mistake, that's the model. The program spans dozens of states, hundreds of subcontractors, and multiple allied nations. Canceling it would mean economic shock across entire regions. So Congress funds it, the Pentagon defends it, and the contractor collects, regardless of performance. This is war profit refined into permanence. But weapons don't operate in isolation. They require bases, roads, fuel depots, housing, food, water, logistics. Which brings us to the final pillar of the pattern. Because if Lockheed monetized combat systems, Halliburton monetized everything around them. Halliburton, turning war support into a guaranteed market. Halliburton was founded in 1919 as an oil services company. Its founder understood something immediately. Wherever oil goes, infrastructure follows. Wherever armies go, infrastructure follows faster. By World War II, Halliburton and its subsidiaries were building bases, airfields, and ports. The military needed speed, not competition. Contracts were often awarded without bids, justified by urgency, and again, cost plus. Korea expanded the model. Vietnam exploded it. Through its subsidiary Brown and Root, Halliburton built roads, airstrips, and installations across Southeast Asia. Political connections mattered. Campaign donations mattered. Access mattered. And after Vietnam, Halliburton didn't disappear. It waited. The Gulf War in 1991 reopened the pipeline. The U.S. military needed rapid infrastructure in the Middle East. Halliburton was already positioned. Then came the moment that crystallized public suspicion, but followed a familiar historical script. Dick Cheney served as Secretary of Defense during the Gulf War. After leaving government, he became CEO of Halliburton. Later, he returned to government as Vice President. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Halliburton, through its KBR subsidiary, received tens of billions in contracts. No bid, cost plus, urgent. Investigations later found overcharges, waste, and billing irregularities. Some fines were paid. The contracts continued. The stock price surged. Executives were compensated. The government absorbed the cost. This wasn't a unique scandal. It was the pattern repeating. The pattern fully exposed. When you line up all 5 cases, DuPont, Rockefeller, Morgan, Lockheed, and Halliburton, you see the same architecture repeated across centuries. Step 1. Position before war. Build capacity in peacetime. Become essential. Step 2. Secure early contracts. Urgency eliminates competition. Step 3. Use cost-plus pricing. Remove risk. Incentivize overruns. Step 4. Embed politically. Distribute jobs, hire regulators, fund campaigns. Step 5. Diversify profits. Turn war money into permanent wealth. Step 6. Normalize the system. Investigations fade. Fines become expenses. The structure remains. Across 150 years, these 5 corporate lineages extracted hundreds of billions in direct war contracts. And that's just the documented portion. The indirect gains, stock appreciation, land purchases, industrial empires built with war capital, push the true figure into the trillions. And all of it is funded by taxpayers. Every shell, every gallon of fuel, every aircraft overrun, every base built twice. Public money, private profit. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. What didn't we build instead? What infrastructure wasn't funded? What medical research wasn't completed? What education wasn't paid for? War didn't just destroy lives abroad, it redirected wealth at home. And in the final part, we confront the moral endgame of this system, not by asking whether war was justified, but by asking why profit was always guaranteed and accountability was never. Because once war becomes a business model, peace becomes a threat. And that changes everything.
By the time you reach the end of this pattern, something unsettling becomes clear. This story is not really about 5 families. It's about a system that learned how to outlive morality. Because once war becomes profitable in a predictable, repeatable way, peace stops being the natural conclusion. It becomes a disruption. Look back across the last century and a half, and you'll notice something strange. Wars end, but the war economy doesn't. After World War II, the most necessary war in modern history, the United States didn't demobilize the way it had after World War I. It didn't dismantle its military industries. It didn't shrink its procurement systems back to peacetime scale. Instead, it locked them in. Permanent bases, permanent defense budgets, permanent contractors. President Dwight Eisenhower warned about this in 1961, calling it the military-industrial complex, but by the time he named it, it was already entrenched. What Eisenhower understood, and what the DuPonts, Rockefellers, Morgans, Lockheeds, and Halliburtons had already mastered, was this. Once enough money flows through a system, the system starts protecting itself. And it doesn't do so with violence, it does so with dependency. Congress depends on defense jobs in their districts. The Pentagon depends on contractors it cannot replace. Universities depend on endowments funded by defense-linked capital. Think tanks depend on grants from companies that benefit from conflict.
and politicians depend on donations, post-retirement careers, and expert validation. This is how war stops being debated purely as policy and starts being managed as an industry. Now let's confront the scale. Across documented public records, these 5 corporate lineages and their successors have extracted hundreds of billions of dollars in direct war-related contracts from American taxpayers. But direct contracts are only the visible layer. The real transfer happens beneath the surface. Deficit spending pushes costs into the future. Interest compounds across generations. Public money becomes private equity. Every bomb paid for today becomes a tax burden tomorrow. And the people who bear that burden, the average taxpayer, the soldier, the civilian caught in the conflict, never see dividends. They see funerals, they see trauma, they see debt. And here's the part that should make you angry, not emotionally, but structurally. If even a fraction of that money had been allocated differently, the American landscape would look radically different. Hundreds of billions could have built national high-speed rail. They could have funded tuition-free higher education for decades. They could have rebuilt infrastructure before it collapsed. They could have financed medical breakthroughs that never came. But war profit doesn't reward long-term public good. It rewards immediacy, urgency, fear. And fear is the most reliable accelerant of spending there is. Now, this doesn't mean every war was fabricated for profit. History isn't that simple. World War II had to be fought. Some conflicts were unavoidable. But here's the distinction most textbooks never make. Even necessary wars were exploited. Budgets were padded, projects were extended, contracts were protected. And unnecessary wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, were made longer, more complex, and more expensive than they ever needed to be, in part because so many institutions benefited from their continuation. The profit motive didn't always start the war, but it made stopping it harder. That's the difference between tragedy and system failure. And when investigations did happen, after World War I, after Vietnam, after Iraq, you see the same outcome again and again. Committees uncover waste, reports document overcharging, fines are issued. No one goes to prison. The fines become a cost of doing business. The contracts continue. The executives retire wealthy. Why? Because these companies are too important to prosecute. The military needs them. The economy depends on them. The political system is intertwined with them. They are too essential to punish. And that is the final lock in the pattern. Accountability exists only where replacement is possible. And replacement in this system has been engineered out. So, when people tell you war profiteering is a conspiracy theory, remember this: the contracts are public, the budgets are published, the corporate earnings calls are recorded. Nothing here is hidden. It's just fragmented across institutions, so no single place feels responsible. Which brings us to the final truth. This system persists because it works for those at the top. It converts chaos into revenue. It converts fear into policy. It converts public sacrifice into private inheritance. And it has done so across 5 families, 6 generations, and every major American war. They position early, they secure contracts, they overrun costs, they hire regulators, they lobby for continuation, they diversify profits. And when the war ends, they are richer than before. The soldiers go home, if they're lucky. The taxpayers inherit the debt, and the system resets, waiting for the next trigger. This isn't anti-American, it's deeply American. It's capitalism doing exactly what it does best when left unchecked: war. So the question isn't whether this will happen again. It already is. The question is whether recognizing the pattern changes anything. History suggests it rarely does, but understanding it changes you. You stop seeing war as random tragedy.
You stop seeing defense budgets as neutral. You stop confusing patriotism with procurement. And once you see that war can be a business model, you never hear the drums the same way again. 5 families, every war, same result. They profit, we pay, and the cycle continues. Unless someone finally decides that peace should be protected with the same intensity as profit.
By the time you reach this point, the story should no longer feel like history. It should feel like a lens. Because once you recognize the war profit pattern, it doesn't stay in the past. It moves forward with you into headlines, budgets, speeches, and breaking news alerts. When a new conflict begins, listen carefully to what happens next. Markets react before memorials are planned. Defense stocks rise before casualty numbers are confirmed. Emergency funding is approved faster than veterans care. That sequence isn't accidental, it's rehearsed. The system doesn't ask whether war is right or wrong. It asks only one question: who is positioned to supply it? And the answer is almost always the same small circle of firms, descendants of the same structures built generations ago. What makes this pattern so durable isn't greed alone, it's normalization. War spending is framed as national security, not as a transfer of public wealth into private hands. Cost overruns are framed as complexity, not incentive. Lobbying is framed as expertise. Think tanks are framed as independent analysis. Every word softens the reality, and the result is a population taught to see war as unavoidable, expensive, tragic, but rarely as profitable by design. This is why no one teaches you this in school, because it doesn't fit into clean categories of hero and villain. It implicates institutions we're told to trust. It forces uncomfortable questions about how democracy behaves under pressure. And it suggests something even more unsettling, that the greatest threat to peace isn't always hatred or ideology, it's reliability. Reliable contracts, reliable profits, reliable political incentives. Peace is uncertain. War, for the right companies, is not. Now, to be clear, this isn't about blaming soldiers. They are not participants in this model. They are its cost. And it's not about denying that some wars were necessary. History is not pacifist fantasy. It's about acknowledging that once war became predictable revenue, restraint lost its economic defenders. No major corporation goes bankrupt when peace breaks out, but many become richer when war does. That asymmetry matters, because systems evolve toward what rewards them. And for 150 years, the American system has rewarded preparedness for conflict far more consistently than preparation for peace. 5 families didn't invent war, but they perfected how to monetize it. And the lesson that echoes forward is this: if you want to understand power, don't watch speeches, watch cash flows. Watch who gets paid before the first shot and who keeps getting paid long after the last one. Because the true story of American war isn't just written in history books, it's written in contracts. And those contracts don't argue ideology, they argue margins. Once you see that, you stop asking, why does this keep happening? You start asking, who benefits if it does? That question doesn't make you cynical, it makes you literate. And literacy, economic, historical, structural, is the first defense against a system that survives by being unseen. 5 families, every major war, same pattern. They positioned early, they got paid first, they faced no real punishment, and the cycle continues, not because people are evil, but because incentives are aligned. History doesn't repeat because we forget, it repeats because we remember and do nothing. If this story changed how you see war, spending, and power, then it did its job. Because the first step toward breaking a pattern is seeing it clearly. And now,
you do.